Hi friends, today we are going to see the new chapter, The Namesake. In 1968, on an sticky August evening, 1 week before her due date, Ashima Ganguli stands in the kitchen of an Central Square apartment. Combine rice crisp size and planter's peanut and chopped red onion in an bowl. She adds salts, lemon juice, then a slice of green chili pepper, wishing there were mustard oil to pour into the mix. Ashima has been consuming these connections throughout her pregnancy. A humble approximation of the snack sold for pennies on Calcutta this war and on railway platforms throughout India, spilling from a newspaper cones, even now that there is barely space inside her. It is the one thing he craves. Tasting from a cupped palm, she frowned as usual. There is something missing. She stared blankly at the pegboard, bent behind the teapot where he cooking utilities hangs, all slightly coated with grease. She wipes sweat from her face with free end of her saris. Her swollen feet aches against speckled grey linoleum. Her pelvis aches from the baby weight. She opens a cupboard, the sleeves lined with a grimsy yellow and a white checkered paper. She has been meaning to replace and reaches for another onion, frowning again as she pulls at it crisp magenta skin. A curious warmth floods her abdomen, followed by a tighten so severe she doubts over. Gasping without sound, dropping the onion with a thud on the floor. The sensation passes, only to be followed by a more enduring spasm of discomfort. In the bathroom, she discovers on her underpants a solid streak of brownish blood. In the bathroom, she discovers on her underpant a solid streak of brownish blood. She calls out to her husband Ashoke, a doctoral candidate in electrical engineer at MIT, who is studying in the bedroom. He leans over a card table, the edge of their bed. Two twin mattresses pushed together under a red and a purple batik spread serves as his chair. When she calls out to Ashoke, she doesn't say his name. Ashima never thinks of her husband's name when she thinks of her husband, even though she knows perfectly well what it is. She has adopted his surname but refuses for property's sake to utter his first. It is not the type of thing Bengali wives do. Like a kiss or cares in Hindi movies, a husband's name is something intimate and therefore unspoken, cleverly patched over, and so instead of saying Ashoka's name, she utters the interrogative that has come to replace it, which translates roughly as, "Are you listening to me?" At dawn, a taxi is called to ferry them throughout the deserted Cambridge streets up Massachusetts Avenue and past Harvard Yard to Mountain Urban Hospital. Ashima registers, answering questions about the frequency and the duration of their contradictions. As Ashoka fills out the forms, she is seated in a wheelchair and pushed through the shining, brightly lit corridors, whisked into an elevator more spacious than her kitchen. On the maternity floor, she is assigned to be a bed by a window. In a room at the end of the hall, she is asked to remove her Murshidabad silk sari in favor of a flowered cotton gown that, to her mild embarrassment, only reaches her knees. A nurse offers to fold up the sari, but, exasperated by the 6 slippery yards, ends up stuffing the materials into Ashima's slate blue suitcase. Her obstetrician, Dr. Ashley, granted handsome in a Lord Mountbatten sort of a way, with a fine sand-coloured hat swept back from his temple, arrived to examine her progress. The baby's head in the proper position has already begun its descent. She is told that she is still in yearly labor, 3 centimeters dilated, beginning to efface. What does it mean dilated? She asked. And Dr. Ashley held up 2 fingers side by side. They draws them apart, explaining the unimaginable thing her body must do in order for the baby to pass. The process will take some time, Dr. Ashley tells her. Given that this is her first pregnancy, labor can take 24 hours, sometimes more. She searched for Ashoka's face, but he has stepped behind the curtain the door has drawn. I will be back, Ashoka said to her in Bengali, and then a nurse added, Don't you worry, Mr. Ganguli. She got a long way to go. We can take over from here. Now she is alone, cut off by the curtains from the 3 other women in the room. One woman name she gathered from the bits of conversation is Beverly. Another is Lois. Carol lies to her left. God damn it, God damn it. You, this is hell, she hears one of them says. And then a man's voice. I love you, sweetheart. Words Ashima had neither heard nor expect to hear from her own husband. This is not how they are. It is the first time in her life she has slept alone, surrounded by the strangers. All her life she had slept either in a room with her parents or with an Ashoke at her side. She wished the curtains were open so that she could talk to the American women. Perhaps one of them have given a talk to American women, given birth, can tell her what to expect. But she had gathered that Americans, in spite of their public declaration of affections, in spite of their miniskirts and bikinis, in spite of their hand-holding on the streets and lying on the top of each other's on hand-holding on the streets and lying on top of each other's on the Cambridge Common, prefers their privacy. She spreads her finger over the knot. Enormous drums her middle has become, wondering where is the baby's feet and hands are at this moment. The child is no longer restless. For the past few days, apart from the occasional flutter, she had not felt into the plunge or kicked or pressed against her ribs. She wonders if she is the only Indian person in the hospital, but a gentle twitch from the baby reminds her that she is, technically speaking, not alone. Ashima thinks it's strange that her child will be born in a place most people enter either to suffer or to die. There is something to uncomfort her in the off-white tiles of the floor, the off-white panels of the ceiling, the white sheets tucked tightly into the bed. In India, she thinks to herself, women go home to their parents to give birth, away from husbands and in-laws and household cares, retreating briefly to childhood when the baby arrives. Another contradiction begins, more violent than the last. She cries out, brushing her head against the pillow. Her fingers grips the chilly rails of the bed. No one hears her. No nurses rush to her side. She had been instructed to time the duration of the contradictions, and so she consulted her watch, a bon voyage gift from her parents, slipped over her wrist the last time she saw them. Aimed airport, confessing and tears. It wasn't until she was on the plane, flying for the first time in her life on a Boeing VC-10, whose defending accent 26 members of her family had watched from the balcony at Dum Dum Airport, as she was drifting over parts of India she would never set foot in, and then even farther south outside India itself, that she would notice the watch among the cavale of matrimonial bracelet on both her arms, iron, gold, coral and conch. Now in addition, she wears a plastic bracelet with a typed label identifying her as a patient of the hospital. She sees the water face turned to the inside of her wrist. On the back, surrounded by the words waterproof, anti-magnetic and shock protector, her married initial AG or inscribed. America's second tick on the top of her pulse point. For half a minute, a band of pain wraps around her stomach, radiating toward her back and shooting down her legs. And then again, relief. She calculates the Indian time on her hands. The tip of her thumb strikes each rungs on a brown ladder etched on the backs of her finger, then stops at the middle of the third. It is 9.5 hours ahead in Calcutta. Already evening, 9:30. In the kitchen of her parents' flat on Amherst Street. At this very moment, a servant is pouring after dinner tea into steaming glass, arranging Mary biscuits on a tray. Her mother, very soon to be a grandmother, is standing at the mirror of her dressing table, untangling waist length hair, still more black than grey with her figures. Her father hutches over his slant ink-stained table by the window, sketching, smoking, listening to the voice of America. Her younger brother, Rana, studied for a physics exam on the bed. She pictures clearly the grey cement floor of her parents' sitting room, feels it solid chill underfoot even on the hottest day. An enormous black and white photograph of her decayed paternal grandfather looms at one end against the pink plaster wall. Opposite an alcove sleeved by clouded paint of her glass stuffed with books and paper, and her father's watercolored tints. For an instant, the weight of the baby vanishes, replaced by the scene that passes before her eyes, only to be replaced once more by a blue strip of a charless river. Thick green treetops, car gliding up and low down Memorial Drive. In Cambridge, it is 11 in the morning, already lunchtime in the hospital's accelerated day. A tray holding a warm apple juice, jelly or ice cream, and a cold baked chicken is brought to her side. Patty, the friendly nurse with the diamond engagement ring and a fringe of reddish hair beneath her cap, tells Ashima to consume only the jello and the apple juice. It is just as well. Ashima would not have touched the chicken, even if permitted. Americans eat their chicken in its skin, though Ashima has recently found out a keen butcher on Prospect Street willing to pull it off for her. Patty comes to full up the pillows, tidy the beds. Dr. Ashley pokes in her head from time to time. No need to worry, he quips, putting a stethoscope to Asima's belly, patting her hand, admiring her various bracelets. Everything is looking perfectly normal. We are expecting a perfect normal delivery, Mrs. Ganguli. But nothing feels normal to Ashima. For the past 18 months, ever since she is arrived in Cambridge, nothing has felt normal at all. It is not so much the pain, which she knows somehow she will survive. It is the consequence. Motherhood in a foreign land. For it was one thing to be pregnant, to suffer the quantity morning in the bed, the sleepless night, the dull throbbing in her back, the countless visits to the bathrooms. Throughout the experience, in spite of her growing discomfort, she had been astonished by her body's ability to make life exactly as her mother and grandmother and all her granddaughters had done. That it was happening so far from home, unmonitored and unobserved by those she loved, had made it more miraculous still. But she is terrified to raise a child in a country where she is related to no one, where she knows so little, where life seems so tentative and spare. How about a little walk? It might do you good, Patty asked when she comes to clear the lunch tray. Ashima looked up from a tattered copy of a desk magazine that she had bought to read on her plane ride to Boston and still cannot bring herself to throw away. The printed pages of Bengali type, slightly rough to the tough, are a perpetual comfort to her. She had read each other's of short stories and poems and the articles a dozen times. There is a pen and ink drawing on the page 11 by her father, an illustrator for the magazine. A view of an North Calcutta skyline sketched from the roof of the flat. One foggy January morning, she had stood behind her father as he had drawn it. Watching as he crouched over his easel, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his shoulders wrapped in a black cashmere shawl. Yes, all right, Ashima says. Patty helps Ashima's out of a bed, tucks her feet out one by one into slippers, wraps a second nightgown around her shoulders. Just think, Patty says as Ashima struggles to stand. In a day or two, you will be half the size. She takes Ashima's arm as they step out of the room into the hallway. After a few feet, Ashima stops, her legs trembling as another wave of pain surges through her body. She shakes her head, her eyes filled with tears. I cannot. You can. Squeeze my hand. Squeeze as tight as you like. After a minute, they continue on toward the nurse's station, hoping for a boy or a girl. Patty asks. As long as there are 10 fingers and 10 toes, Ashima replies. For these anatomical detail, this particular sign of life, or the one she had the most difficulty picturing when she imagines the baby in her arm. Patty smiles a little too widely, and suddenly Ashima realizes her error. Nose, she would have said. Fingers and toes. This error pains her almost as much as her last contractions. English has been her subject. In Calcutta, before she was married, she was working towards a college degree. She used to tutor neighborhood school children in their homes, on their verandas and beds, help them to memorize Tennyson and Wordsworth, to pronounce words like sign and cough, to understand the difference between Aristotelian and Shakespearean tragedy. But in Bengali, a finger can also mean fingers, a toe, toes. It had been after twittering one day that Ashima's mother had met her at the door, told her to go straight to the bedroom and prepare herself. A man was waiting to see her. He was the third in as many months. The first had been a widower with 4 children. The second, a newspaper cartoonist who knew her father, had been hit by a bus in Esplanade and lost his left arm. To her great relief, they had both rejected her. She was 19, in the middle of her studies, in no rush to be a bride, and so obediently, but without expectation, she had untangled and rebatted her hair, wiped away the coal that has smuggled below her eyes, patted some kutikura powder from a velvet puff on her skin. The sheer parrot green sari she pleated and tucked into her petticoat has been laid out of her on the bed by her mother. Before entering the sitting room, Ashima had paused in the corridor. She could hear her mother saying, she paused in the corridor, is fond of cooking, and she can knit every extremely well. With a week, she finished this cardigan I am wearing. Ashima smiled, assumed by her mother's salesmanship It had taken her the better part of a year to finish the Cariden, and still her mother had to do the sleeves. Glancing at the floor where visitors customarily remove their slippers, she noticed beside two sets of chappals a pair of men's shoes that were not like any she would ever seen on the streets and trams and the buses of Calcutta or even in the widow of Bata. They were brown shoes with the black heels and of white lace and stitchings. There was a band of lengthier sized holes embossed on their either side of each shoes, and at the tip was a pretty pattern pricked into a leather as if with a needle. Looking more closely, she saw the shoemaker's name written on the insides in gold lettering that had all but faded. Sometime and Sons, it said. She saw the size 8.5 and the utilities USA as her mother continued to sing her praises. Ashima, unable to resist a sudden and overwhelming urge, stepped into the shoes at her feet. Lingering sweat from the owner's feet mingled with her, causing her heart to race. It was the closest thing she had ever experienced to touch of a man. The leather was creased, heavy and still warm. On the left shoe she had noticed that one of the crisscrossing laces had missed a hole, and this oversight set her at ease. She extracted her feet, entered the room. The man was waiting in an rattan chair. His parents perched on the edge of a twin bed where her brother slept at night. He was slightly plump, scholarly looking but still youthful, with a black thick-framed glasses and a sharp, prominent nose. A neatly trimmed moustache connected to the beard that covered only his chin lent him an elegant, vaguely aristocratic air. He wore a brown socks and a brown trousers and a green and a white striped shirts and was staring glumly at his knees. He did not look up when she appeared, though she was aware of his gaze, and she crossed the room, but by the time she managed to steal another look at him, he was once again indifferent, focused on his knees. He cleared his throat as if to speak, but then said nothing. Instead, it was his father who did the talking, saying that the man had gone to St. Xavier's and then B. College, graduating the first class first from both the institutions. Ashima took her a seat and smoothed the pleat of her sari. She sensed the mother eyeing her with approval. Ashima was 5 feet 4 inches tall for a Bengali woman, 99 pounds. Her expression was on the dark side of fair, but she had been compared on more than one occasion to the actress Mahabai Mukherjee. Her nails were admirably long, her fingers, like her father's, artistically slim. They inquired after her studies, and she was asked to read a few stanzas from the Daffodils. The man's family lived in Alipur. The father was a labor officer for the customers department of a shipping company. My son has been living abroad for 2 years, the man's father said, earning a PhD in Boston, researching in the field of fiber optics. Ashima had never heard of Boston or a fiber optics. She was asked whether she was willing to fly on the plane and there if she was capable of living in a city characterized by severe snowy winters alone. Won't he be there? She asked, pointed to the man whose shoes she would briefly occupied, but who had yet to say a word to her. It was only after the betrothal that she would learn his name. 1 week later, the invitations were printed, and 2 weeks after, she was adorned and adjusted by the countless aunts, countless cousins hovering around her. These were her last moments as Ashima Bhaduri before becoming Ashima Ganguli. Her lips were darkened, her brows and cheeks dotted with a sandalwood paste, her hair wounded up, bound with the flowers held in a place by 100 wire pins that would taken her to remove once the wedding was finally over. Her head was wrapped with scarlet netting. The air was damp, and in spite of the pins, Ashima's hair, thickest of all the cousins, would not lie flat. She owes all the necklaces and the chains and the bracelets that were destined to live most of their lives in an extra large safety deposit box in the bank wallet in the New England. At the designated hour, she was seated on a pyre that her father had decorated, hoisted 5 feet off the ground, carried out to meet the groom. She had hidden her face with a heart-shaped betel leaf, kept her head bent low until she had circled him 7 times. 8,000 miles away in Cambridge, she had come to know him. In the evening, she cooks for him, hoping to please with the unrationed, remarkably unblemising the sugar, flour, rice and the salt she had written about to her mother in her very first letter home. By now, she has learned that her husband likes his food on the salty side, that his favorite things about lamb curry is the potatoes, and that he likes to finish his dinner with a small final helpings of a rice and dal. At night, lying beside her in the bed, he listens to her describe the event of her day, her walks along Massachusetts Avenue, the shops she visits, the Hare Krishnas who pester her with their leaflets, the Picasso's ice cream cones she treats herself to an Harvard Square. In spite of an meager gratitude student wakes, he sets aside money to send every few months to his father to help put an extension on his parents' house. He is fastidious about his clothings. Their first argument have been over a sweater she would shrunk in the washing machine. As soon as he comes home from the university, the first thing she does is hanging up his shirts and trousers, donning a pair of an drawstring pyjamas and a pullover if it is cold. On Sundays, he spends an hour occupied with his tins of shoes, polishers, and these 3 pairs of shoes, 2 black and 1 brown. the brown one or the most ones he would be wearing when he would first come to see her. The sight of him cross-legged on newspapers spread on the floor, intently whisking a brush over the leather, always reminds her on her interdictions in her parents' corridor. It is a moment that stalks her still, and that she prefers in spite of all she tells him at night about the life they have now shared, to keep to herself. On another floor of the hospital, in a waiting room, Ashok hunches over a Boston Globe from a month ago, abandoned on a neighboring chair. He reads about the riots that took place during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and about Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, being sentenced to 2 years in jail for threatening to counsel a draft evaders. The Favi Luba strapped to his wrist is running 6 minutes ahead of a large grey-faced clock on the wall. It is 4:30 in the morning, an hour before Ashok has been fast asleep. Ashima side of a bed covered with exams he had been grading late at nights. When the telephone rang, Ashima was fully dialed and being taken to the delivery room. The person on the other end had said, upon arrival at the hospital, he was told that she was pushing, that it could be any minute now, any minute. And yet it seems only the other day, one steel-colored winter morning, when the windows of the house were being pelted with hail, that she had spit out her tea, assuming him of mistaking the salt for sugar. To prove himself right, he had taken a sip of an sweet liquid from her cup, but she had insisted on its bitterness and poured it down the sink. That was the first thing that had caused her to suspect, and then the doctor had confirmed it, and then he would wake to the sound every morning when she went to brush her teeth for her retching. Before he left for the universities, he would leave a cup of tea by the side of the bed, where she lay listless and silent. Often, returning in the evenings, he would find her still lying there, the tea untouched. He now desperately needs a cup of tea for himself, not having managed to make one before leaving the house. But the machine in the corridor dispenses only coffee, tepid at best, in the paper cups. He takes off these thick rimmed glasses fitted by a Calcutta optimistic, polishes the lenses with a cotton handkerchief he always keeps in his pocket. A for Ashok, embroidered by his mother in a light blue thread. His black hair, normally combed back neatly from his forehead, is dill-heaved, section of it in one end. He stands and begins packing as the other expectors' fathers do. So far, the door to the waiting room has opened twice, and a nurse has announced that one of them has a boy or a girl. There are handshakes all around, pats on the back before the father is escorted away. The man waits with a cigar, flowers, address, books, bottles of champagne. They some cigarettes, ashes on the floor. Ashok is indifferent to such indulgence. He neither smokes nor drinks alcohol of any kind. Ashima is the one who keeps all their addresses in a small notebook she carries in her purse. It has never occurred to him to buy his wife flowers. He returned to the globe, still passing as he reads. A slight limp causes Ashoke's right foot to drag almost imperturbability with each step. Since childhood, he has had the habit and the ability to read while walking, holding a book in one hand on his way to the school. From room to room in his parents' three-story house in Alipore, and up and down the red clay stairs. Nothing roused him, nothing discarded him, nothing caused him to stumble. As a teenager, he had gone through all of Dickens. He read newer authors as well. Graham Greene and Somerset Maugham, all purchased for his favorite stalls on College Street with Pujo money. But most of all, he loved the Russians. His parental grandfather, a former professor of an European literature at Calcutta University, had read from them along in English translations when Ashoke was a boy. Each day at a tea time, as his brothers and the sisters play kabaddi and cricket outside, Ashoke would go to his grandfather's room. And for an hour, his grandfather would read and sustain on the bed, his ankles crossed and the book propped open on his chest. Ashoke curled at his side. For that hour, Ashoke was deaf and blind to the world around him. He did not hear his brother and sisters laughing on the rooftop or see the tiny, dusty, cluttered room in which his grandfathers read. Read all the Russians and then reread them. His grandfather, he said, they will never fail you. When Ashoke English was good enough, he begins to read the books himself. It was while walking on some of the world's noisiest, busiest street on the Garyhead Road that he had read the pages the brothers Karamanjao and Anna Karina and the father and sons. Once the younger cousin who had tried to imitate him had fallen down the red clay stairs in Ashoka's house and broken an arm. Ashoka's mother was always convinced that her eldest son would be hit by a bus or a train, his nose deep into the war and peace, that he would be reading a book the moment he died. One day in the earliest hours of October 20, 1961, this nearly happened. Ashoka was 22, a student of a BE college. He was traveling on the 83 up Howrah Ranchi Express to visit his grandparents for the holidays. They have moved from Calcutta to Jamshedpur upon his grandfather's retirement from the university. Ashoka had never spent the holidays away from his family, but his grandfather had recently gone blind, and he had requested Ashoka company specifically to read him the statement in the morning. Ashoka accepted the invitation eagerly. He carried 2 suitcases. The first one containing the clothes, the gifts, the second is empty. For it would be on the visit his grandfather had said that the books in his glass-fronted case, collected over a lifetime and preserved under the lock and the key, would be given to Ashoka. The books have been promised to Ashoka throughout his childhood, and for as long as he could remember, he had covered them more than anything else in the world. He had already received a few in the recent years, given to him on the birthdays and other special occasions. But now that the day had come to inherit the rest, a day his grandfathers could not no longer read the books himself, Ashoka was saddened. And as he placed the empty suitcase under his seat, he was discomforted but it is weightlessness, regretful of the circumstances that would cause it upon his turn to be full. He carried a single volume for the journey, a hard-bound collection of the short story by Nikolai Gogol, which his grandfather has given him when he is graduated from class 12. On the title page, beneath his grandfather's signature, Ashoke had written his own. Because of Ashoke's passion for this particular book, the spine had recently split, threatening to divide the pages into two sections. His favorite story in the book was the last, the overcoat, and that was the one Ashoka had begun to reread, and the train pulled out of Howrah stations late in the evening with a prolonged and defending shriek away his parents and his 6 younger brothers and sisters, all of whom had come to see him off and had huddled until the last moment by the window, waving to him from the long dusky platform. He had read the overcoat too many times to count. Certain sentences and the phrases embedded in his memory. Each time he was captivated by the absurd, tragic, yet oddly inspiring story of Aki Vange, the impoverishment main characters who spent his life meekly copying the documents written by others and suffering the ridicule of absolute everyone. His heart went out to the poor Ake, a humble clerk just as Ashoka's father had been at the start of his career. Each time reading the accounts of Ake's christening at the series of queer names his mother had rejected, Ashok laughed aloud. He shuddered at the description of the tailor Pretty Watch's big toe, with its deformed nail as thick as hard as the shell of an tortoise. His mouth watered at the cold veal and a cream, patties and champagne. Ake consumed that the night his previous coat was stolen, in spite of the fact that Ashoka had never tasted these things himself. Ashoka was always devastated when Ake's was robbed in a square that looked to him like a dreadful desert, leaving him cold and vulnerable. Ake's death, some pages later, never failed to bring tears to his eyes. In some way, the story made less sense each time he read it. The scene he pictured so vividly and absorbed so fully, growing more exclusive and profound. Just as Ake's ghost haunted the final page, so did it haunt a place deep in an Ashoka's soul, shedding light on all that was irrational, all that was inevitable about the world. Outside, the view turned quickly black, the scattered light of an Howrah giving way to nothing at all. He had a second-class sleepers in the 7th voyage. Behind the air-conditioned coach, because of the season, the train was especially covered, especially ratious, filled with families on holiday. Small children were wearing their best clothing, the girls with a bright colored ribbon in their hair. Though he had had his dinner before leaving for the station. A 4-layer tiffin carrier packed by his mother sat at his feet. In the event that hunger should attack him in the night, he shared his compartment with the 3 others. There was a middle-aged Bihari couple who, he gathered from overhearing their conversation, had just married off their eldest daughter, and a friendly, pot-bellied, middle-aged Bengali businessman wearing a suit and tie by the names of Ghosh. Ghosh told Ashok that he had recently returned to India after spending 2 years in England on a job voucher, but that he had come back because his wife was inconceivably miserable abroad. Ghosh spoke relevantly of England, the sparkling, the empty street, the polished black cars, the row of gleaming white houses, he said, were like a dream. Trains departed and arrived according to the schedule. Ghosh said, no one spat on the sidewalks. It was in a British hospital that his son had been born. Seen much of this world? Ghosh asked Ashok, untying his shoes and settling himself cross-legged on the berth. He pulled a packet of Dunhill cigarettes from his jacket pocket, offering them around the compartment before lighting one of himself. Once to Delhi, Ashok replied, and lately once a year to Jameshpur. Ghosh extended his arms out the window, flicking the gauling tip of his cigarettes into the night. Not this world, he said, glancing disappointedly about the interior of the train. He tilted his head towards the window. England, America, he said, as if his nameless villages they passed have been replaced by those countries. Have you considered going there? My professor mentioned it from the time to time. But I have a family, Ashok said. Ghosh frowned. Already married? No, a mother and a father and 6 siblings. I am the eldest. And in a few years you will be married and living in your parents' house. Ghosh speculated. I suppose. Ghosh shook his head. You are still young, free, he said, spreading his hands apart from emphasis. Do yourself a favor before it is too late, without thinking too much about it first. Pack a pillow and a blanket and see as much of the world as you can. You will not regret it. One day it will be too late. My grandfather always says that's what the book are for. Ashok said, using the opportunity to open the volume in his hands to travel without moving an inch. To each his own, Ghosh said. He tipped his head politely to one side, letting the last of the cigarette drop from his fingertips. He reached into a bag by his feet and took out his diary, turning to the 12th of October. The page was blank, and on it he wrote his name and address. He ripped out the page and handed it to the Ashok. If you ever change your mind and need contacts, let me know. I live in Tolligin, just behind the tram depot. Thank you, Ashok said, folding up the information and putting it at the back of his book. How about a game of cards? Ghosh suggested. He pulled out a well-worn deck from his suit pocket with a Big Ben image on the back. But Ashok politely declined, for he knew no card games, and beside which he preferred to read. One by one, the passengers brushed the teeth in the vestibule, changed into their pyjamas, fastened the curtains around their compartments, and went to sleep. Gosh offered to take the upper berth, climbing barefoot up the ladder, his suits carefully folded away so that Ashok had the window to himself. The Lahiri couple shared some sweet from a box and drank water from the same cup without either of them putting their lips to the Rhine. Then settled in their berth as well, switching off the lights and turning their heads to the wall. Only Ashok continued to read, still seated, still dressed. A single small bulb glowed dimly over his head. For time to time he looked through the open window at the ink Bengal night, at the wedge shape of an palm tree and the simplest of the homes. Carefully he turned the soft yellow pages of his book. A few delicately tunneled by worms. The steam engine puffed a reassuring powerfully. Deep in his chest he felt the rough jostle of the wheels. Spark from the smokestack passed by his window. A fine layer of an sticky scotch dotted one side of his face. His eyelid, his arm, his neck. His grandmother would insist that he scrub himself with a cake of an Margot soap as soon as he arrived. Immersed in the sartorial plaint of Aki, lost in the wide, snow-white, windy avenue of St. Petersburg, unaware that one day he was to dwell in an snowy place himself. Ashok was still reading at 2:30 in the morning. One of the few passengers on the train who was awake when the locomotive engine and 7 bogies delivered from the boat luggages line. The sound was like a bomb exploding. The first 4 bogies capsized into an depression along the side of the track. The 5th and the 6th contained the first class and the air-conditioned passengers telescoped into each others, killing the passengers in their sleep. The 7th, where Ashoka's was sitting, capsized as fell, flung by the speed of the crash farther into the field. The accident occurred 209 miles from Calcutta, between the Gashila and Dalmurbagh station. The train guard's portable phone would not work. It was only after the guard ran nearly 5 kilometers from the site of an accident to Galicia that he was able to transmit the first message for help. Over an hour passed before the rescuer arrived, bearing latrines and shovels and the axes to pry the bodies from the car. Ashok can still remember their shouts, asking if anyone was alive. He remembers trying to shout back unsuccessfully, his mouth emitting nothing but the faintest rasps. He remembered the sound of a people half dead around him, moaning and tapping on the walls of the train, whispering hoarsely for the help. Words that only those who were also trapped and injured could possibly hear. Blood drenched his chest and the right arm of his shirt. He had been thrust part away out the window. He remembers being unable to see anything at all. For the first hours, he thought that perhaps, like his grandfather, whom he was on his way to visit, he would gone blind. He remembered the acrid odor of flames, the buzzing of the flies, the children crying, the taste of the dust, and the blood on his tongue. They were nowhere, somewhere in an field. Miling about them were villagers, police inspector, a few doctors. He remembers believing that he was dying, that perhaps he was already dead. He could not feed the lower half of his body and was so unaware that the mangled limb of a gauche was wrapped over his leg. Eventually, he saw the cold, unfriendly blue of earliest morning, the moon and a few stars still lingering in the sky. The page of his book, which has been tossed from his hand, fluttered into two sessions a feet away from the train. The glare from a certain lantern briefly caught the pages, momentarily distracting one of the recurrers. Nothing here. Ashoka heard someone says, "Let's keep going." But the lantern's light lingering just long enough for Ashoka's to raise his hand, a gesture that he believed would consume the small fragment of a life left in him. He was still clutching a single page, the overcoat, crumbled tightly in his fist, and when he raised his hand, the weight of a paper dropped from his finger. "Wait!" he heard a voice cried out. "The fellow by that book. I saw him move." He was pulled from the wreckage, placed on a stretcher, transported on another train to a hospital in Tatanagar. He had broken his pelvis, his right femur, and three of his ribs on the right side. For the next few years of his life, he lay flat on his back, ordered to keep as still as possible as the bone of his body healed. There was a risk his right leg might be permanently paralyzed. He was transferred to Calcutta Medical College, where two screws were put into his hips. By December, he had returned to his parents' house in Alipore, carried through the country yard and up the red clay stairs like a corpse hoisted on the shoulders of his four brothers. 3 times a day he was spoon-fed. He urinated and defeated into an tin pan. Doctors and the visitors came and went. Even his blind grandfather from Jamshedpur paid a visit. His family have saved the newspaper accounts. In a photograph, he observed the train smashed to the shreds, pingle jaggly against the sky. Security guards sitting on an unclaimed belongings. He learned that the fish plates and the bowls has been found several feet from the main track, giving rise to the suspicions, never subsequently confirmed, of stoppage. That body had been mutilated beyond recognition. Holiday makers, tryst with death, the Times of India had written. Thank you.